What if the sky above us is not as empty as we believe? On a clear night, Earth looks serene from below. Stars hold their places. The moon drifts patiently. Everything appears orderly, charted, known. We like to believe that the space surrounding our planet is mapped with precision, every object logged, named, and understood. That belief offers comfort. It suggests mastery. It tells us we are no longer lost. But history has a habit of complicating our certainties. In the early years of the space age, when rockets still failed more often than they succeeded, radar operators stared into glowing screens with quiet intensity. Each blip mattered. Each trace represented a human achievement or a threat. The Cold War turned orbit into a new kind of frontier, one defined by suspicion and silence. Every launch was watched. Every satellite was counted. And then something appeared that did not belong. It wasn't dramatic at first, just an object, a return on radar, a shadow in motion where no shadow was expected. It followed a path that defied the norms of the time, circling Earth in a way no known machine could easily manage. Neither side claimed it. Both assumed the other was lying. In that moment, certainty fractured. This is where our story begins, not with answers, but with unease, with the realization that even in an age of careful tracking and technical prowess, something could slip through unnoticed, or worse, be noticed and still remain unexplained. Over the decades that followed, similar moments would repeat. Objects would appear in catalogs with question marks attached. Satellites thought dead would stir again. Hardware believed destroyed would resurface years later, like messages washed ashore from forgotten voyages. Some anomalies would eventually find explanations. Others would not. What makes these stories compelling is not the temptation to imagine something extraordinary lurking above us. It is something quieter and more human. They reveal how incomplete our records can be, how fragile institutional memory is, how easily intention becomes assumption, and assumption becomes belief. Space, it turns out, is not just a physical environment. It is an archive, and like all archives, it reflects the people who built it, their ambitions, their secrecy, their errors, their blind spots. This narrative is not about hidden invaders or cosmic warnings. It is about the limits of knowledge, about the difference between what we think we control and what we actually understand. Each object we will encounter is a fragment of a larger story, a reminder that exploration always leaves behind loose ends. Some of these objects were born of urgency, launched in moments when speed mattered more than documentation. Others were designed to observe quietly, their true purposes wrapped in layers of classification. A few may simply be artifacts of confusion, their legends growing as facts blurred over time. Yet taken together, they form a pattern worth examining. As we move forward, we will drift from the tense radar rooms of the 1960s to the crowded orbits of the present day. We will follow trajectories that bend, stall, and sometimes vanish altogether. Along the way, we will ask not just what these objects are, but what they reveal about us. Because every machine we place in orbit is a reflection of human choice, and every mystery we fail to resolve tells us something about how memory fades, how records fracture, and how even the most advanced civilizations can lose track of their own creations. The sky above us is busy, more crowded than we imagine, and somewhere among the thousands of silent travelers circling our planet are stories that refuse to stay neatly catalogued. The question is not whether something unknown has ever been up there. The question is why we are so uncomfortable admitting that sometimes we simply don't know. What happens when a machine appears before we are ready to name it? In the winter of 1960, radar screens along the northern edge of the United States traced the familiar arcs of known satellites. Operators could tell, at a glance, which belonged to whom. Orbits had signatures, speeds told stories. Nothing moved without reason. Then a track emerged that felt wrong. It wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't moving the way experience said it should move. The object followed a polar path, slicing over the planet from north to south, a route few satellites could reach at the time. Launch vehicles were crude. Fuel was precious. Most early spacecraft hugged the equator like swimmers afraid of deep water. This one did not. Initial estimates suggested mass, far more mass than expected. 10 tons, perhaps more. Too heavy for public rockets. Too stable for experimental ones. And most troubling of all, unclaimed. Quiet questions traveled up the chain of command. Analysts assumed deception. Surely the Soviets had launched it and denied it. Surely this was the opening move of some elaborate ruse. But inquiries returned empty. Across the ocean, similar conversations were happening in mirrored rooms, with the same unease and the same conclusion. No one had ordered this thing into the sky. Publicly, nothing was said. To speak would be to reveal too much. What could be seen, how clearly, and from where. Silence was safer. Within classified circles, the object acquired a name that carried weight without explanation. A placeholder, a label for uncertainty, the Black Knight. It was tracked intermittently, never fully lost, never fully understood. Radar returns suggested slow rotation, an awkward tumbling that didn't resemble spinning rocket stages or dead satellites. Some operators reported slight changes in velocity, subtle enough to be dismissed, unsettling enough to linger in memory. At a time when most satellites fell back to Earth after months, this one endured. Years passed. Technology improved. New launches crowded the sky. And still, the object remained. Sometimes visible, sometimes quiet, always unresolved. It appeared in internal catalogues under shifting designations, never quite settling into an official explanation. In 1963, during a solitary orbit high above Earth, an astronaut glimpsed something green and luminous outside his capsule window. Ground control offered reassurance, optical effects, reflections, fatigue. But radar stations far below registered something nearby, briefly sharing his path before slipping away. The moment passed. The mission continued. No formal report followed. By the late 1990s, the story resurfaced in an unexpected way. During a space shuttle mission, astronauts photographed a dark, irregular object drifting nearby, its shape angular, its surface oddly textured. The explanation came quickly: a detached thermal blanket, space debris, harmless and familiar. Yet those who studied the images felt the old unease stir. The proportions seemed off, the contours unfamiliar. The explanation sufficient, perhaps, but not satisfying. Skeptics argue that the Black Knight is not a single thing at all, that decades of sightings have been braided into one legend, that radar anomalies, lost debris, misidentified hardware, and imagination have merged over time. It is a reasonable position. History is full of stories inflated by repetition. And yet, declassified documents confirm at least this much. An object in polar orbit was detected in 1960, and no one could account for it. That fact alone matters, because it exposes a fragile assumption that every object in orbit begins with a recorded launch and ends with a documented fall. The Black Knight, whatever its true nature, slipped between those lines. It lived in the margins of certainty. Perhaps it was debris from an unacknowledged test. Perhaps a fragment from an early failure, its origins obscured by secrecy and time. Or perhaps it was simply the first lesson in orbital humility, that even at the dawn of the space age, we were already capable of losing track of our own machines. The mystery does not demand belief. It invites restraint, a reminder that history is often less complete than we pretend, and that unanswered questions are not failures of imagination, but markers of our limits. When something appears in the sky without a name, the real discomfort is not what it might be. It's what its silence says about us. What if an object remembers Earth better than we do? On a quiet night in November 1991, a telescope in Arizona caught sight of something small and fast-moving against the fixed backdrop of stars. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another near-Earth object, one more entry in a growing catalogue of cosmic neighbors. The sky is full of rocks, after all. Most pass unnoticed. Some briefly earn a name before fading back into obscurity. This one refused to behave. Designated 1991 VG, the object traced a path around the Sun that looked uncannily familiar. Its orbit echoed Earth's own, nearly circular, closely aligned, as if the two were engaged in a slow, synchronized dance. Statistically, this was unusual. Nature tends toward chaos. Asteroids arrive from distant reservoirs with elongated, tilted trajectories. Few linger so politely near our planet's lane. Astronomers leaned in. As observations continued, another oddity emerged. The object's brightness rose and fell in a steady rhythm, not randomly, as tumbling rocks often do, but with a regularity that suggested shape, cylindrical, perhaps, hollow, something that caught sunlight, then released it, again and again, like a turning mirror. The resemblance to spent rocket hardware was hard to ignore. Calculations traced its past and future. 1991, VG had come close to Earth before, slipping past in the mid-1970s. It would do so again decades later. Its motion hinted at capture and release, as if Earth's gravity had briefly claimed it, then let it go. This, too, was strange. Temporary satellites exist, but they are rare and fleeting. Some researchers began to ask an uncomfortable question. Could this be something we made? The Apollo era left behind debris, upper stages, adapters, forgotten components sent into solar orbit once their purpose was fulfilled. Perhaps one of them had wandered back, yet inventories were thorough. Serial numbers accounted for. Nothing fit. The size estimate, 5 to 10 meters, was plausible, but the reflected light told a different story. Its spectral signature did not match known alloys or paints used on rockets, nor did it match typical asteroid compositions. It occupied a narrow corridor between categories. In 1992, a physicist proposed what many were quietly considering. Maybe 1991 VG was artificial. Not alien, not extraordinary, simply human-made, launched long ago, its records misplaced or misclassified. A technological echo, returning without an introduction. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it slipped away. As the object receded, it grew faint, beyond the reach of available instruments. Tracking attempts failed. It vanished into the glare of the sun, leaving behind equations and debates. When predictions suggested it would return for another close pass in 2017, anticipation built. Telescopes were ready, models refined. But the sky was empty. Either the calculations were wrong or something had altered its course. A gentle push from sunlight, a gravitational nudge we hadn't accounted for, or perhaps the assumptions themselves were flawed. The object did not behave as expected because it was never what we expected. Today, 1991, VG sits uneasily in official records, classified as a near-Earth object of uncertain origin. Probably natural, possibly artificial. No conclusion strong enough to settle the matter. Its story resists resolution not because it demands mystery, but because it exposes the thinness of our categories. We divide the universe into neat boxes, natural and manufactured, random and intentional. Yet objects like this blur those lines, reminding us that once something leaves Earth, it enters a realm where oversight weakens and memory fades. If 1991 VG was a piece of forgotten hardware, it means we have already lost track of something we built with care and precision. If it was natural, then coincidence can sometimes imitate design with unsettling accuracy. Either way, the lesson is the same. Orbit is not ownership. Proximity is not understanding. And the paths objects take around our planet may say as much about the limits of our knowledge as they do about the things themselves. Sometimes, the most unsettling discoveries are not those that challenge our place in the universe, but those that quietly suggest we don't fully remember what we've already done. What if something returns home that was never meant to come back? In September 2002, a faint point of light appeared where none had been before. Amateur astronomers noticed it first, an object caught briefly by Earth's gravity, looping into an irregular orbit as if unsure whether to stay. Temporary moons are rare, and this one behaved with peculiar familiarity. It was given a catalogue number, J02E3. At first glance, it seemed like just another wandering fragment, perhaps a small asteroid, snared by chance. But as telescopes focused and data accumulated, the object began to tell a different story. Its brightness fluctuated in a way that suggested rotation, not chaotic, but patterned, the kind of motion seen in engineered objects rather than natural ones. Then came the light itself. Spectral analysis revealed something unmistakable: titanium dioxide, the same compound used in the white paint that once coated Saturn V rockets. The implication landed softly, then all at once. This wasn't just artificial. It looked like a relic from the most iconic era of human spaceflight. The obvious conclusion was comforting. An old rocket stage, a forgotten piece of Apollo hardware, something misplaced, then found again. But comfort quickly gave way to complication. Every Saturn V third stage, the S4B, was accounted for. Some were sent into solar orbit. Others were deliberately crashed into the moon, their impacts recorded by seismometers left behind by astronauts. One such impact in 1969 caused the lunar surface to ring like a bell for over an hour. The records were clear. No stages were missing. And yet, J02E3 fit too well to ignore. Researchers attempted to match its orbit with known missions. Apollo 12 emerged as the closest candidate. Timing aligned. Materials matched. But documentation insisted that its S4B had struck the moon exactly as planned. If that was true, then what was circling Earth in 2002? The contradiction lingered. Some proposed an error in historical records. Others suggested a test flight, an undocumented maneuver, a clerical mistake carried forward for decades. Each explanation strained credibility in its own way. The Apollo program, after all, was among the most meticulously documented endeavors in history. For a brief window, J023 offered a chance at resolution, observations intensified, measurements refined, but orbits are unforgiving, and Earth's gravitational grip is temporary. In 2003, the object drifted away, slipping back into solar orbit, beyond easy reach. Before it left, one thing became clear. It was almost certainly built by human hands. Where, when, and for what purpose remained unanswered. Predictions suggest it may return again, perhaps around 2032, once more brushing past Earth like a messenger with a half-remembered story. When it does, instruments will be better, data sharper, but even then, certainty is not guaranteed. J023 occupies an uncomfortable space in our history. It looks like evidence of a mistake we don't remember making, a reminder that even our proudest achievements may leave behind loose threads. We tend to think of space exploration as a series of milestones: launch, orbit, landing, return. Clean arcs with clear endings. But objects like this suggest a messier truth, that some artifacts drift beyond our narratives, detached from their origins, becoming questions rather than accomplishments. The deeper unease lies not in the object itself, but in what it implies, that records can mislead, that memory, even institutional memory, can erode, and that something launched with intention can circle back decades later, no longer recognized by those who sent it away. Perhaps J002E3 is simply debris, its story mundane and lost to paperwork. Or perhaps it is a quiet testament to how exploration outpaces documentation. When something returns home unannounced, the real mystery is not how it survived the journey. It's why we failed to remember it was ever ours. What if something we believed was asleep never truly stopped moving? In 1969, as the world's attention focused on footprints pressed into lunar dust, another launch slipped quietly into orbit. It carried no astronauts, no cameras meant for public wonder. Its purpose was watchfulness. Designated with a string of letters and numbers, rather than a name, it belonged to a classified military program built on vigilance and patience. The satellite, later known as PSSC-2, was designed to look outward, not inward. Its highly elongated orbit carried it far from Earth, then swept it back over sensitive regions at precise intervals. From that distance, it listened, it observed, it gathered fragments of information meant for rooms without windows. For years, everything followed expectations. Then, sometime in the mid-1970s, the satellite was declared inactive. Fuel depleted, systems powered down. Another piece of Cold War hardware, drifting into quiet irrelevance. Official records noted its retirement, and attention moved on to newer machines, sharper eyes, faster processors. Space, however, does not erase so easily. In the 1990s, a small group of civilian satellite trackers began noticing something subtle. PSSC-2's orbit was changing. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to be noticed by those who watched carefully. Its path shifted in ways that atmospheric drag could not explain. Gravitational influences alone were insufficient. It was behaving as if someone or something was still guiding it. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Satellites of that era were not designed for longevity. Once powered down, they were meant to drift, decay, and eventually burn up. PSSC-2's fuel should have been gone, its systems silent. Yet the data persisted. Requests for clarification met familiar obstacles. Statements were vague, documents heavily redacted, questions redirected. The satellite existed, but its status remained carefully undefined. It was neither confirmed alive nor declared inert. It simply continued, quietly adjusting its place in the sky. In 2001, the ambiguity deepened. PSSC-2's orbit changed more noticeably, shifting into a configuration that required active propulsion. This was no slow decay, no accidental perturbation. It was deliberate. The implications were uncomfortable. One possibility was that the satellite had never truly been retired, that it had continued operating, intermittently, for decades beyond its advertised lifespan. Another suggested something more procedural, that a newer satellite had inherited the identity of an older one, using its designation to slip unnoticed into existing catalogs. A shell game played among numbers and assumptions. There was also the idea of reactivation, that PSSC-2 had been designed, improbably, with the capacity to sleep and wake again, to wait years, even decades, before being called back into service. Modern satellites can do this. Those built in the 1960s were not supposed to, and yet the evidence refused to settle. What makes the story unsettling is not the presence of secrecy. Classified programs exist for reasons. It is the erosion of trust in the boundaries we believe separate past from present. When a satellite declared dormant begins to maneuver again, timelines blur, definitions soften. Is it still the same object if its purpose changes? Is it the same mission if its name remains, but its function evolves? PSSC-2 remains in orbit today, occasionally shifting, occasionally quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not transmit explanations. It simply persists. In a sense, it embodies a broader truth about our relationship with technology. We design machines with clear intentions, then release them into environments where control is never absolute. Over time, those machines outlive their original context. They accumulate ambiguity. Perhaps PSSC-2 is still working, faithfully executing tasks defined long ago. Perhaps it is something else entirely, wearing an old identity like a borrowed coat. Or perhaps the confusion lies not in the satellite, but in our records. The sky does not care what we declare finished. It only responds to what continues to move. And sometimes, the most unsettling realization is that the line between inactive and alive is thinner than we once believed. What if a satellite could reach out and touch another? In the quiet stillness of geostationary orbit, satellites hang, suspended above the equator, locked in place as the Earth turns beneath them. From 36,000 kilometers away, they appear motionless to ground observers. Communications satellites, weather monitors, surveillance platforms, all spaced apart in a delicate celestial choreography. They are not meant to move too close, not meant to touch. Then one did. In 2016, a Chinese satellite named Shijian-17, abbreviated SJ-17, was launched with little fanfare. Officially, it was described as a communications satellite, part of a standard program of space technology demonstration. It entered geostationary orbit like thousands before it. But SJ-17 didn't stay still. Not long after arriving, satellite watchers noticed something unusual. SJ-17 began drifting. Slowly at first, then with intent. It maneuvered across the sky, not randomly, but toward other satellites. First, it approached a defunct Chinese spacecraft known as China 20. It drew close, closer than was considered normal. Then, after a brief proximity, China 20's orbit shifted. SJ-17 had moved it. What happened in those quiet moments between approach and departure remains invisible from Earth. There was no public broadcast, no official declaration of capability, just the subtle after effect. A dead satellite in a new position, nudged or towed, or somehow persuaded to change course. Then SJ-17 kept going. Over the months that followed, it visited other satellites. It approached, lingered, then moved on. Each time, the visited object's trajectory changed. Western analysts watched with growing unease. To maneuver in geostationary orbit with such precision is no small feat. The delta V, or change in velocity required, is significant. The fuel demands are high. The control systems must be finely tuned. This wasn't just a test of movement. It was a demonstration of control. The possibilities unfolded quickly. A satellite that can approach others could inspect them. It could repair them. It could disable them. It could carry tools or weapons. China stated that SJ-17 was experimenting with debris mitigation, learning to move dead satellites out of harm's way. A reasonable explanation, a hopeful one. But capabilities, once demonstrated, are rarely viewed in isolation. What made SJ-17 more mysterious was the opacity around its design. No images were released, no diagrams made public. Observers speculated about robotic arms, grappling mechanisms, or magnetic tethers. No confirmation came, only the movements, quiet, calculated, undeniable. In 2019, SJ-17 approached the vicinity of several U.S. military satellites. It did not make contact, but its path made clear that it could, if it chose to. For the first time, a satellite had not only claimed space, but the ability to change space for others. Its continued presence in orbit today is a silent reminder of this shift. SJ-17 still moves. It still watches. It still occasionally sidles up to other satellites with the quiet confidence of something that has already shown what it can do. And with it, the fundamental assumptions about the sanctity of orbit have changed. Satellites were once considered passive, their trajectories stable, their purposes singular. SJ-17 revealed a new class, active agents capable of interaction, subtle and unseen. Not weapons, perhaps, but not neutral. The implications ripple outward. In a domain where proximity equals possibility, the mere approach of one satellite to another now carries meaning. It can signal cooperation or intent. It can be a gesture of help or a rehearsal for interference. The question SJ-17 leaves behind is not just technical, but philosophical. When machines can touch each other in the vacuum of space, who decides what is contact and what is confrontation? And when orbits are no longer permanent, how do we define safety? The sky, once static, has begun to move in new ways, and not all of them are easily explained. What if we seeded the sky with millions of needles and then forgot where they went? In the early 1960s, during the most fevered years of Cold War innovation, the United States launched a project so ambitious and strange that even today it reads like science fiction. Its name was West Ford. Its purpose, to build an artificial ionosphere above Earth using 500 million copper needles. Project West Ford was born from fear, not of enemies, but of silence. Military planners worried that a nuclear war could disrupt Earth's natural ionosphere, severing long-range communications. Satellites were new, fragile, and unproven, so engineers proposed a backup, a thin belt of tiny metal dipoles circling Earth in high orbit to bounce radio signals between distant points on the ground. Each needle was just 1.8 centimeters long, thinner than a human hair. Launched together, they would disperse into a shimmering belt, a man-made echo chamber stretching around the globe. The first attempt, in 1961, failed. The needles clumped and did not separate. But in 1963, a second launch succeeded. Nearly 500 million copper wires were released into space at an altitude of 3,700 kilometers. It worked, briefly. For a moment, signals bounced successfully from ground stations to the orbital band and back. The proof of concept was real. But almost immediately, the project became a source of controversy. Astronomers protested. Scientists warned about unintended consequences. The Soviet Union accused the US of polluting the heavens. The needles, officials assured the world, would deorbit naturally. Solar radiation would slowly push them into the atmosphere, where they would burn up. Within a few years, they said, nothing would remain. But they were wrong. Some of the needles never dispersed as planned. Others clumped into clusters, stuck together by static charge or manufacturing imperfections. Decades later, radar systems still detect strange returns, tiny debris clouds at high altitude that don't match any known satellites. Collision avoidance systems occasionally register unidentified threats in the altitude range of the West Ford Belt. We can't see the individual needles, they're too small. But we know they're there. The needles became ghosts in the sky, too numerous to track, too scattered to clean up, too small to individually detect. And yet, collectively, they represent one of the largest artificial debris fields humanity has ever created. Even stranger, some scientists believe these clusters may still reflect radio signals. There have been reports of unexplained radio interference from specific regions of the sky. Inconsistent, fleeting, but present. It's possible that 50 years later, the West Ford Belt still whispers. What makes the project so haunting is not its ambition, but its amnesia. We launched 500 million objects into orbit. We assumed they'd disappear. We didn't build in a way to retrieve them. We didn't keep a detailed map of where they ended up. And now, all these decades later, we've lost track of our own creation. It is a parable of technological optimism, born in a moment when the reach of human engineering felt limitless. Yet today, it stands as a cautionary monument to oversight, a reminder that in space there is no away. Everything we send up stays unless we bring it back. The West Ford needles are still circling us, quiet, invisible, mostly forgotten, but not gone. They are the first whispers of a much larger problem we now face, the slow crowding of Earth's orbit with debris we no longer control. And they ask a simple question, one that echoes from high above. When we lose track of what we ourselves have made, what else might we have forgotten? What if a satellite was designed to be seen, yet impossible to follow? In December 2019, a rocket lifted off from Cape Canaveral, piercing the Florida sky with a trail of fire and silence. On board was a satellite known only as USA 276. Its launch was not secret, too visible for that, but everything else was. The satellite entered an unusual orbit, not one of quiet stability, but one of deliberate complexity. It stretched from low Earth altitudes up toward the distant heights of geostationary orbit, then swept back down again in long looping curves. A surveillance platform, perhaps, a test bed. No official purpose was announced. Then the maneuvers began. Unlike most satellites, which maintain stable positions with the occasional course correction, USA 276 was constantly shifting, It changed altitude. It altered inclination. Its velocity adapted day by day. To amateur satellite trackers, those persistent watchers of the sky, it became a ghost. Predicting its position became a challenge. Observing it became a pursuit. USA 276 was not hiding. It was evading. What made it more intriguing and more unsettling was what it started to do. The satellite began approaching others in orbit, both American and foreign. It would drift close, pause, then drift away. No collision, no contact, but close enough to raise eyebrows and blood pressure. Observers speculated, was it inspecting these satellites, taking high-resolution images, scanning their thermal profiles, testing vulnerability? No one knew. The U.S. Space Force offered only silence. USA 276 was conducting national security operations, and that was all they would say. By 2020, the satellite had approached Russian and Chinese military satellites with surgical precision. Russia called the behavior provocative. China lodged a complaint at the United Nations. But the patterns continued. USA 276 never lingered long. Just enough to observe, to learn, perhaps to warn. Its movements were so fluid, so unpredictable, that some began to wonder if it carried stealth features, coatings, or configurations that reduced its radar signature. At times, it would disappear from observation entirely, only to reappear days or weeks later in a new location. It was, in effect, the first satellite that seemed to move like a spy in orbit, not just watching from a distance, but approaching, studying, and vanishing before it could be caught. In the decades since Sputnik, we have grown used to the idea that what goes up can be seen, tracked, and catalogued. Transparency in orbit, even among rivals, was assumed. It was part of the uneasy peace of space, a realm for competition, yes, but also mutual visibility. USA 276 changed that. It embodied a new paradigm, one in which satellites can act like drones, maneuverable, inquisitive, and opaque. Its existence forces a re-evaluation of what it means to share orbital space. What rules apply when one machine approaches another in silence? Is that communication, interference, harassment? The laws of space are still written in the language of the 20th century. USA 276 speaks a different dialect, one of ambiguity and motion. It doesn't declare its presence, it simply shows up. Today, the satellite remains in orbit, still active, still unconfirmed in purpose. A quiet actor in the upper theater of Earth's skies. Its legacy may be less about what it does and more about what it represents, the end of orbital predictability. Once, we looked up and believed we could map the heavens. Now, we must ask, what does it mean when even the watchers can no longer be watched? What if a satellite carried more than it claimed and revealed its secrets in layers? In November 2019, Russia launched a satellite into low Earth orbit under the name Cosmos 25142. It was described as an inspector satellite, a platform to test technologies for evaluating and servicing other spacecraft. This was not unusual. On-orbit servicing was becoming a global interest, repairing satellites, refueling them, maybe cleaning up debris. But Cosmos 2542 had other plans. Soon after reaching orbit, it did something unexpected. It opened. Or more precisely, it released something. A smaller satellite emerged. Cosmos 2543. Like a matryoshka doll cracking open in zero gravity, one satellite became two. And then the second satellite began to move. It wasn't just a passive payload. It had propulsion. It could maneuver. And it did. Cosmos 2543 began adjusting its orbit, approaching a U.S. military reconnaissance satellite known as USA 245. Over weeks and months, it drew closer, carefully, precisely, until the distance between them narrowed to less than 200 kilometers. In the vastness of space, that is a whisper. Then the second doll opened. Cosmos 2543 released a third object, smaller still, unnamed, unacknowledged. It detached and moved independently, behaving like a probe, or a test, or something else entirely. At this point, the United States Space Force went public with its concern. Russian nesting satellites circling a critical American asset was no longer a quiet maneuver in the dark. It was theater, deliberate and unmistakable. Russia responded. The satellites, they said, were simply conducting experiments in space debris mitigation, a reasonable claim. On its face, the technology to track, approach, and potentially remove defunct satellites is essential, but intentions live in the details. In 2020, the smallest of the three Russian objects performed an unexpected act. It released something at high velocity, a test perhaps of projectile technology. Western analysts saw it as a weapons test, a demonstration that a satellite could carry and deploy something with force, not an explosion, not a collision, but a message. Suddenly, the idea of satellites as passive tools became obsolete. Cosmos 2542 and its companions were not just platforms. They were platforms that contained potential weapons. The nesting dolls were no longer symbolic. They were literal. And they raised a question that technology had quietly avoided for decades. How many satellites are not what they seem? If a satellite can carry another inside it, and that one a third, how many objects in orbit today are incomplete pictures? How many catalog satellites are actually systems waiting to deploy hidden elements? In the aftermath, Cosmos 2542, 2543, and their smaller offspring continued their journey. Their maneuvers became subtler. They faded from headlines, but they remained, orbiting in silence. And in that silence was a lesson. Space is not empty, nor is it entirely open. Beneath the smooth language of inspection, testing, and experimentation, there now exists a new category of capability, the ability to deploy, observe, and potentially act with no warning. The nesting doll satellites mark a turning point in orbital history. They are not the first to carry hidden payloads, but they are among the first to reveal those payloads in a public, strategic gesture, a performance meant to be seen. Which leaves us with the broader question: if these satellites can divide and deploy, how many others already have? And if space has become a place where things are not what they seem, what else is waiting to be revealed? What if a forgotten object re-entered Earth's atmosphere and no one knew where it came from? On a quiet morning in November 2015, an object was predicted to fall from space into the Indian Ocean, just off the coast of Sri Lanka. The timing was precise, the coordinates specific. The name, however, was not. It carried the designation WT-192F, a label that said nothing about what it actually was. It was not large, a few meters long perhaps, no danger to people, no panic. But to scientists, it was a rare opportunity, an artificial object returning from space with enough warning to study it. Observatories and aircraft were quickly organized to watch the descent, and yet no one could say what exactly was falling. WT-192F had been spotted only weeks earlier, moving on a strange, highly elliptical orbit that swung it far beyond the moon before returning to Earth's vicinity. Its path suggested it had been circling the Earth-Moon system for years, possibly decades, without detection. An object hiding in plain gravitational sight. More curiously, its behavior defied natural expectation. Its low density implied it was hollow, perhaps made of lightweight metal or composite material. Not rock, not ice. This wasn't a natural asteroid. It looked unmistakably like debris. But from what? Searches through mission archives began. Could it be a leftover stage from the Apollo era? A Soviet lunar mission? A failed probe from the early days of space exploration? One by one, each possibility fell away. Known Apollo hardware was accounted for. Soviet records, fragmentary as they were, offered no match. China's early lunar missions came too late. WT-1190F didn't fit any known origin. On November 13, 2015, the object re-entered Earth's atmosphere and disintegrated harmlessly over the ocean. Just as predicted, it left no recoverable wreckage, just data, images, spectra, and timing from telescopes and aircraft, and a lasting question mark. In its final moments, WT-1190F confirmed what scientists suspected: it was artificial. But that was all. There were no markings, no signals, no match in the registry of space junk. It was an orphan in the sky, parentless, unclaimed, and lost to history. What makes this event more than a curiosity is its implication. Here was an object circling Earth for years, possibly since the 1960s or 70s, undetected, untracked, and unrecognized. Only when its orbit decayed enough to fall did it draw attention. How many others might still be out there, hiding in the vastness between Earth and Moon? Most of our tracking infrastructure focuses on low Earth orbit, where thousands of satellites, space stations, and debris pieces zip around the planet in a chaotic ballet. Beyond that, in the cislunar space between Earth and Moon, surveillance thins. Objects can linger there, slow and faint, beyond the reach of most radars and telescopes. WT-1190F reminds us that the boundaries of our knowledge are not technological alone. They are archival, bureaucratic, historical. This was likely our own artifact, something launched with purpose, then abandoned in space, its documentation misplaced, its trajectory unmonitored. In a world where every spacecraft launch is carefully recorded, it is deeply human to assume we've accounted for it all. But we haven't. There are things above us that no one remembers. Things built by human hands, set adrift, and long since detached from their stories. The sky, like the ocean, returns what we forget. WT-1190F burned brightly for a moment, silent, originless, and unresolved, and in doing so, it illuminated the growing recognition that space is not just a new frontier. It is also a graveyard of memory. What if a research satellite was only pretending to do research? Between 1973 and 1996, the Soviet Union, and later post-Soviet Russia, launched a series of satellites under the name Bion. These missions were described openly as scientific, biological research platforms carrying animals, plants, and microorganisms into space to study the effects of microgravity on living systems. The Bion program seemed like an oasis of transparency in an otherwise secretive era. Payloads were sometimes shared with Western partners. Experiment data was published. Recovery capsules returned to Earth with scientific results. The missions fit neatly into the narrative of peaceful space exploration. And yet, something didn't quite align. Amateur satellite trackers, quietly observing orbital behavior, began to notice discrepancies. Some Bion satellites occupied higher orbits than needed for biological studies. Others performed minor but deliberate maneuvers, burns to adjust their position or inclination in ways unnecessary for passive science experiments. More troubling was what came through the airwaves. The radio transmissions from certain Bion satellites were far more frequent and encrypted than expected. Military-grade protocols, bursts of data that had little to do with biology. These weren't just signals relaying the heartbeats of spacefaring rodents. Something else was happening on board. Then came the leaks. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union dissolved and barriers of secrecy eroded, fragments of truth emerged. Insiders hinted at dual-purpose missions. The biological experiments were genuine, but not always the primary objective. Hidden beneath their visible cargo were classified payloads, surveillance equipment, signals, intelligence receivers, and optical sensors. It made a kind of sense. What better camouflage than a satellite filled with frogs and fruit flies? The biological veneer offered legitimacy, plausibility, even international goodwill. No one suspects a laboratory of espionage. The deception became more difficult to deny during the final Bion mission, Bion 11, in 1996. That mission suffered a partial failure. The return capsule, meant to bring back the biological specimens, did not separate from the main satellite. It remained in orbit far longer than planned. And during those unexpected extra weeks, ground stations recorded unusual activity. The satellite continued to maneuver. It continued to transmit. It behaved not like a failed biological experiment, but like an active surveillance platform adjusting its position for strategic observations. Eventually, Bion 11 re-entered and disintegrated in Earth's atmosphere. The official story never changed. But to those watching closely, the story had already evolved. What makes the Bion satellites intriguing is not just the possibility of hidden purposes. It's the subtle way truth was obscured without being fully denied. The biology was real. The experiments had scientific value. And yet, a shadow mission ran alongside. It reveals something about the language of space. Orbits, like words, can carry double meanings. A satellite can be both what it says it is and something else entirely. The gap between declared purpose and actual function becomes not just a technical issue, but a matter of trust. How many other satellites, declared civilian, are in fact dual use? The legacy of Bion is not conspiracy, it is complexity. Space missions often serve more than one master. Scientific curiosity and strategic necessity are not always at odds. But when one is used to mask the other, the line between openness and obfuscation blurs, and the sky becomes just a little harder to read. In the end, the Bion satellites ask a simple question. What happens when even our instruments of discovery are built to deceive? And in that answer lies a deeper reflection on how easily wonder and war share the same orbit. What if the catalogue of objects orbiting Earth is less complete than we think? Our modern world is built on the assumption that space is mapped, that we know what's above us, that every satellite, fragment, and relic in orbit is logged, tracked, and if needed, explainable. It's a comforting fiction, one bolstered by powerful radars, sprawling databases, and international cooperation. But reality is messier. From the first unexplained radar blips in 1960 to the emergence of active inspector satellites in the 2020s, Earth's orbital space has revealed itself to be far less transparent than it appears. Objects arrive with no declared launch. Others remain long after their missions were supposedly over. Some move when they shouldn't. Others return unexpectedly, like memories dislodged from deep time. One truth unites these stories. Our records are incomplete. The Black Knight satellite, detected during the Cold War, was never claimed by either superpower. It orbited in silence, defying classification. Was it debris? A test? A ghost story born of coincidence and secrecy? Then came 1991 VG, an object whose Earth-like orbit and brightness shifts suggested artificial origins. But no nation owned it. It fit no launch. It matched no material. And when it vanished, it left no trail, only questions. JM-2E3 returned decades after it was presumed gone, a piece of Apollo hardware that shouldn't have still existed, whose records insisted it had crashed. And yet, there it was, circling Earth again, like a relic that had outlived its own story. Others, like PSC-2, blur the line between life and dormancy. Satellites officially decommissioned decades ago that still maneuver, as if stirred by unseen hands. Are they active in secret? Are they ghosts of past missions, reanimated for new tasks under old names? Then there are the newcomers, SJ-17, Cosmos 22542, USA 276, machines that don't just observe, but interact. They move with precision. They approach other satellites. They separate into smaller pieces. They display capabilities that are acknowledged only through silence. Each suggests that orbital activity is not just increasing, but evolving. Even the past surprises us. The Westford Needles, launched in the 1960s, were supposed to vanish. They didn't. Their legacy lingers in the form of clumps of space debris, too small to see and too numerous to ignore. They are evidence of a time when ambition outpaced caution, and when we assumed we'd be able to clean up later. Tu-1-EF, the re-entering object of 2015, was perhaps the most poetic reminder. A hollow shell tumbling through space for decades before falling to Earth in silence. Artificial, human-made, but nameless, lost in the bureaucracy of forgotten missions. And the Bion satellites, whose noble purpose as biological laboratories masked secret instruments and hidden agendas. Even their names misled. Experiments in plain sight, while other sensors gathered data no one was meant to know about. All of this suggests a deeper, more unsettling possibility. That space is full of things we've forgotten and others we were never told about. Even as we expand our reach, deploying constellations and exploring new worlds, the orbit around Earth becomes a layered archive, not just of technology, but of decisions, secrets, and overlooked truths. Each object tells a story. Some are incomplete, some deliberately obscured, and some may never be understood at all. The question is not whether there are objects in orbit that remain mysterious. The question is how many and what they say, not just about what we've put into space, but about the limits of how well we remember, record, and reckon with what we've done. What if some things in orbit were never meant to be known? From the ground, the sky feels like a frontier, open, infinite, available. We send satellites and probes with clear missions, launch them with precision, and track them with confidence. But above the clouds, beyond the noise of human life, something different happens. Objects in orbit take on lives of their own. Take USA 276, shifting like a phantom through the heavens, inspecting other satellites in ways that defy simple classification. Or SJ-17, gently touching other spacecraft in the deep stillness of geostationary orbit. Or the nesting satellites of Cosmos 2542 and 2543, revealing smaller companions like secrets hidden within secrets. These machines don't behave like the satellites of old. They move with intention, with curiosity, with capacity. They remind us that satellites are no longer passive. They don't just sit and listen. They act, they maneuver, they interact, and in doing so, they reveal the blurry edges of our assumptions about what space is and isn't. Once, we believed that the sky above was well mapped, that we knew what circled our world, that any anomaly could be explained with time, data, and diligence. But the Black Knight satellite was detected in 1960 and claimed by no nation. 1991, VG returned to Earth's neighborhood with a strangely Earth-like orbit, whispering of lost hardware or something else entirely. WT11F fell from the sky without a name. J02E3, presumed destroyed, came back, and the Bion satellites, launched for science, carried payloads they never announced. These are not wild conspiracies or tales of alien visitors. They are reflections of something quieter and perhaps more profound: the limits of institutional memory, the complexity of human intention, and the thin thread of documentation stretched across decades of technological ambition. Every satellite is launched for a reason, but not every reason is recorded. And even when it is, that record can fade, buried in archives, lost to reorganization, erased by time or deliberate silence. The truth is, we don't fully know what is orbiting Earth. We know most, but not all. And in a domain where proximity can become peril, and where unseen capabilities might be deployed in an instant, that ignorance carries weight. The implications stretch beyond military strategy or scientific oversight. They touch something human. Because if we cannot keep track of the machines we create, if we can forget them, misidentify them, or use them for hidden purposes, what else might we forget? What else might slip from memory into myth? Space is not a blank canvas. It is a layered story, one written in light, velocity, and silence. Each object circling above us is a page. Some are legible, some are smudged, some were written in a language never meant to be shared. As we stand on the edge of a new era of commercial spaceflight, lunar return missions, and interplanetary dreams, the need to understand what's already up there becomes not just technical, but ethical. The mystery of orbit is not about aliens. It is about us, about how we remember, about how we record, about what we choose to reveal, and what we let drift, slowly, into darkness. The sky above us is not just full of stars, it is full of stories, and many of them are still waiting to be told. What if the greatest mystery isn't what's out there, but how much we've forgotten? In the end, this is not a story about extraterrestrial visitors or forbidden technology. It's a story about us, about how, over decades of ambition and secrecy, the space surrounding Earth has become a mirror, one that reflects the limits of our control, our memory, and our transparency. 14 stories, 14 anomalies. Some confirmed, others debated. A few, perhaps, misunderstood. But each one points to a deeper truth. The archive of Earth's orbit is incomplete. There are objects up there whose origins we cannot verify, machines we made, then lost track of, missions that served more than one purpose, only some of which were ever shared. What do we call a satellite that comes back when the records say it crashed? Or a probe that was never logged in the first place? What about the ones that move on their own decades after deactivation, or that quietly shadow others with silent intent? There is no single conspiracy, no grand design tying these cases together, but there is a pattern, a human one. We build, we deploy, we forget. We conceal for reasons of security only to lose sight of what was hidden. We catalogue with imperfect systems. We rely on memory that fades. And in doing so, we leave behind a trail of objects, some useful, some inert, some mysterious, circling above a planet that no longer remembers launching them. The sky has become an attic, full of old tools, broken furniture, and unmarked boxes. And like any attic, it tells a story not just of what was once valuable, but of what was once forgotten. Some of these stories feel benign: misplaced rocket stages, decaying hardware, projects born in moments of urgency. Others hint at something more intentional: surveillance hidden in science, maneuvering cloaked in silence, identities repurposed to avoid detection. But each of them, no matter how seemingly small, adds weight to a larger question. What kind of spacefaring species loses track of its own machines? As we look toward new ventures, lunar bases, Mars missions, asteroid mining, the clarity of our past becomes vital, not just for safety, but for accountability, for ethics, for humility, because space does not forgive our assumptions. It reflects them. And the orbit around Earth, once thought of as a clean frontier, is now layered with echoes, whispers of past missions, mistakes, and secrets, some harmless, some not. The future of space will depend on many things: technology, diplomacy, imagination. But it will also depend on our willingness to confront what's already there. The Black Knight, 1991. VG, J002, E3, SJ17, Westford Needles, Cosmos Nesting Dolls. All of these are not just anomalies, they are reminders that even the highest achievements of human ingenuity can become mysteries when documentation fades and silence settles in. So the next time we look up at the night sky, at the steady arc of a satellite crossing overhead, we might ask not just what it is, but what we've chosen to remember and what we've quietly let go. Because in the stillness of orbit, the past doesn't disappear. It drifts, and every now and then, it comes back around.